Okay, thank you very much for everyone turning up today. Those went on a site visit. I hope you got a bit more knowledge of what we're talking about today. We have got 4 people in the university, and I will grab one of them to speak. If we move straight on to that item, Lee, I think you're going to take us through the report. Oh no, we've got apologies.
We've got apologies and declarations.
Yep.
Please.
Apologies, everyone.
Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Bergelein and Councillor Young, and we've also who have another interest in this item, and also from Councillor Davis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Declarations of interest, anyone? Here? Brilliant. We'll move on to the application. There's only one today, and it's easier to do it in here than it is to do it in the main clock room. So Lee, if you'd like to take us through the application, please.
Sorry, Chair, just before Lee does that, can I just, I'm conscious that there are some members who weren't actually on the site visit, but just a brief summary of what we did, and for the benefit of members of the public. We did attend a site visit actually at the UEA this morning, and members of the Planning Applications Committee saw the exterior of the existing Aston wall and where the proposed extension is going to go. We also, it was pointed out to members on the site visit, the location of the trees that were going to come out as part of the application proposals, and we also had a look on 3 floors of the existing building where we members had the chance to view the existing layout and also see some of the structural issues faced by the building, including in the hotspur, and also some of the implications of the asbestos issues inside the building. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Lee.
Right, thank you, Chair, and good morning, members. Just quickly go through the first images. So, many of you will know the university. This is the approach as you're coming down from Home Road with the security lodge just in front of you, then the site itself probably just beyond a bank of trees, which is seen in the screen. And this here is just looking across the bottom end of Earlham Park, and then we have Violet Grove, which stretches down to the river valley. So the junction between Telson's Drive and University Drive, as University Drive splits off into 2 separate directions. And then we have the entrance to the main university car park, and then we have University as it heads eastwards. So the area itself is relatively sort of busy in terms of traffic, pedestrian flow, cyclists, etc. And we have here, which is as you come down, pull down from the north, and we have sort of the main sort of access point for pedestrians, which is then repeated as you come off the other spur from University Drive. And then we have what is the junction, present junction, into the bottom end of the service area next to the art spur, and then we have the folks area of the building here, which is part of the seating hall, and the building here, which is the art spur. So the development is looking at what is basically the teaching hall. This is the teaching hall which runs through here, and extending it in 2 elements on its north elevation, with a bridge link between those 2 elements. And then there's further works within the art spur, and then a lift extension to the art spur itself. And then we have a subterranean almost link past the chemistry and bioscience research in this part here. We have improvements going forward to the provide sort of additional bin store and saline tank store in the service area as it exists at the moment. Within the development area, we have a existing widened access, bringing you down into 3 disabled parking spaces, and then service access to bin stalls and then back into the building through this route here. Additionally, there's some minor realignment of pedestrian routes coming from Chancellor's Drive and from the link down from Burn Road. And then there's a revamp of the existing cycle parking area, and then there's a link coming through here, and then we have the existing link for people coming east from the east onto the main walkway past the end of the teaching hall. So I'll have a quick look at a typical floor plan. So it's sort of split into corridor spaces, so you have circulation, and there's some neat points here that we've discussed whereby you don't have sort of internal walls touching windows, so they're sort of splayed away. At the present time, there's part of the problem where within, certainly the north side of the teaching hall, we have blanked off windows, which don't look terribly attractive. So we're through design, trying to improve these elements of the building itself. In terms of the two extension parts, we've asked for sort of a glazed link separation, so that it appears to be sort of a separate entity to the teaching hall. And then we have sort of the bridge connections coming through this space. One of the sort of big things which has been controversial potentially from day one is the sort of the location of parts of machinery. So you can see from this roof layout there is a sort of extensive requirement for equipment to serve what is essentially sort of the science part of the building. You also see from this plan the sort of the way that the plant screen has been provided to cut back and forth and away from the edge of the building. And you also here get a sense of the PV array which will be going on the building to meet some of the energy requirements through policy. So looking at things which are pulled away from the south elevation and screening and plant being focused more towards the back of the building. And then here you see the bridge connections and the oversailing plant and equipment at the top. You get a sense of the ground level adjustments coming through into that service area for the new bin and access points. And you also sort of see some of the link through swale features as part of the sustainable drainage. So looking at the original principles, we wished to see what originally was a design intent for Lansdowne itself, to have interconnectivity through the entirety of the teaching hall. So there was sort of some fluid relationships between all of the faculties using the building. So what has been introduced at certain lower levels is a potential to connect through to the building. This is beneficial in terms of educational purposes, but it's also beneficial in providing sort of an acceptable, welcoming and level access for people with disabilities. At the present time, the teaching hall itself, as you would have probably seen, is incredibly difficult to access unless you are in one or other end of the building, and it's sort of served primarily by stair access from the walkway levels. Looking at some of the sort of the detail of the requirement for modern day research and science layouts, the university has been looking for a sort of increase in depth to give an ideal depth of building of 28 metres, which provides for sort of lab accommodation and offset ancillary lab spaces and breakout teaching spaces. And then going through the building, you can see that the areas in red are predominantly sort of lab spaces, and then we have other teaching and learning spaces in green. This has been developed further, so we have an idea of sort of the flexible mixed-use nature. We also now have sort of the School of Engineering coming in to this part of the building. They have recently established in what is the Institute of Productivity in Building 6 down close to Sainsbury Centre to enable potential future phases. Then it's future-proofing that particular faculty to move into this building. Other existing faculties which use Building 3 at the present time have been relocated within the campus and provided with spaces or new spaces. And some of those will come back into this building. Some of the sort of the specialist investigation and research type users will then have double height spaces to be able to operate more successfully within this building. So all in all, it's been a useful dialogue and a useful conversation with the university to enable them to firstly sort of manage their growth and sort of refurbishment of the teaching hall, but also ensure some sort of reliability in terms of high-grade spaces which aren't likely to cause them problems in the future, which in turn then de-risks operations on campus and especially within the teaching hall. So if we look now at the view from the harbour, so the teaching hall itself is potentially seen as sort of a backdrop as you sort of view through, and the harbour was originally designed by Lasden as a sort of a cut-out welcoming space to give that sense of a building, a set of buildings sitting above a valley in sort of Italianate style. And then we have sort of the very distinct nature of the teaching hall, which provides this strong strata sitting behind, which is punctuated by some of the sort of the service halls which sort of run through the building and other elements which have been agreed in the past for sort of services on the roof. The walkway, which runs through here, is also part of the listing on campus, and the teaching hall itself is great to have listed. And then the relevance of that is in relation to what Lasden originally sort of saw. I think this is the second version of the master plan for the campus. You can sort of see some elements have been built. You can sort of see some areas of ziggurats which have been built, and the areas of the main teaching hall which have been built. And originally it would have gone to roughly where the Sainsbury Centre is at the present time, with additional ziggurat buildings wrapping around this edge and running down into the broad area. But the key area to focus on is where we have what has been built to Building 3 and the chemistry section. And this would have been what has in fact been built as a spur connecting to an entirely separate second teaching hall, to that being the original intent. So the buildings of interest within the immediate vicinity are Registry Tower, which is of architectural interest. We have Founders Green, and certainly the east end of the teaching hall, which again are sort of landscape value and heritage interest. This end, I believe from memory, was finished by Fieldman Mawson as a sort of a later part of works by Lasden, because when Lasden had developed on the site in the 1960s, there was a sort of a series of parts of the teaching hall which were later infilled in a slightly different style by Fieldman Mawson in terms of their interior, but they certainly, as you saw from the early image, kept that sort of main focus of the strata and the horizontal strength of the teaching hall in terms of its architectural presence. So the proposal, you see here the east elevation, so you see these various elements. So it becomes, as I say, separated and a subsidiary building because it isn't competing with the strength of banding on the east end and the views from Founders Green. And then you sort of see the clearer side elevation of the art spur. There is some addition to the roof of the art spur, as there will be some addition in higher levels in terms of the height in relation to the main teaching hall. There will also be this new lift, but the existing stair of interest is retained and kept visible. And then we see here a section in the opposite direction as well we saw earlier, giving a sense of some of the heights of spaces as you go into the building and the ridge link between the two extensions. So we have edge view of the existing concrete service tower and the edge view of north of the building. And then we have east side of the art spur, and then north of the service tower, existing service tower, and then we have the north edge of teaching hall, Building 3, and then this is just a cut in. So the extension itself has been through negotiation has been set back from the very front edge of the passageway at the east end of the teaching hall, and so fabric is retained is an element. We've also asked for this area of the service tower to be kept exposed, and through negotiation we've also stepped the building away from the art spur. So you now see key areas of the building retained and visible, with the two new extensions and link being a sort of a prominent new step. Of interest, when we sort of start talking about the design of the building, we didn't necessarily want it to mimic the original building. We felt it important that it becomes a new entity in itself, given that the university was stepping away from the idea of introducing a second wall as part of the original Lansdowne master plan, and instead it becomes more of an extension along the lines of sort of the BMRC, or possibly even the thin connection to CISA, or even the sort of connections that you see through the Lawrence Stenhouse building. This was going to be a new building which had its own architectural language, but through investigation it was noted that we have the Fibonacci golden ratio, which has been repeated within the design of the new extension to give a continuity, although the language will start to feel quite different. So again, service tower, which is left exposed, and then, as just mentioned, the escape stair, which is of significance, because we have here effectively an unfinished element of Lansdowne, which has significance in itself in terms of the history of the building. So if you'd imagine that this would have linked into another teaching hall, roughly where the people are walking at the present time. So this concrete stair is a sort of well-designed temporary, I say temporary, fixing has been there some significant time now. But over time it's become important in terms of its relationship to the building and in understanding the history of the building. So we see here sort of the entirety of the north elevation, where you see those elements clearly visible and elements of historic fabric retained. And the idea is also within these sort of double height glass spaces that you would still have potentially some of the panel features and window openings retained within those spaces, so as you enter the building there's still an appreciation of the original architecture. So we have a section through showing part of the complication of the teaching wall. The added complication of the teaching wall is the very way it steps down the valley. So you have floor areas which are in part subterranean, and we have the opportunity that arises to introduce a link through at the end of the side spur into a new lift, which then solves part of the problems in how you service the building. So whilst there will be a retention of fabric through here, there will be still some service access with the disabled parking bays just where beyond this area of landscaping. Because also the car park has to change in level to get an improved access and level access coming off Chancellor's Drive. We've also asked for the surface to be cut back so it doesn't impinge on the building, it doesn't run up to the building. The building is still announced as a separate entity. So it will be a similar arrangement that you have with the Enterprise Centre on some of its elevations, certainly on the elevation of the Enterprise Centre as you walk next to the Rose Garden on Owen Park, where you have a line of flints drop down in an area, so providing a design feature, but also being beneficial in terms of keeping the extension and other works away from the core building. So here we have an indication of the retained elements which have been negotiated as part of the pre-act process. Behind the concrete stair will be a new glass wall, so linking through into the new lift on the building. So you will then get an access into the end of the arch spur, which again will improve functionality. Service access is as existing, but will be widened. There will be some loss of trees, but those are primarily within this space, with this grouping here at the lower end, and then we'll probably see some of the other trees that are lost in a moment. So, aerial shot, giving you a sense of what is being proposed. And so, cut back from the end, we have a sort of repeat walkway portico feature, double extension with bridge links, a large amount of servicing which is screened on the roof, but the screening pulled back to limit its impact. And then we have the lift on the arch spur, glazed wall, and then increase in height of the arch spur itself. So you'll see, looking at sort of the tree screening, this should be mainly retained, so the building will be visible as predominantly sort of deciduous planting with a mix of some evergreens in this location. So in the winter period there will be some visibility of the building, but most of the rest of the year it will be reasonably well screened from the wider area. And then as you can see here, as you're on site this morning, some of you'll see trees on this side of the walkway being removed, and then the intention is that you'll have a swale feature running through here. So in terms of tree removals themselves, we have a grouping here, small grouping here, and then to enable the extensions, and then to enable improved access, we have a tree coming off the corner. As you come through, so you have the existing walkway through here, so it just opens up this space a bit more to allow more people to come through the various walkways. Obviously, one of the problems we've had over the years with the university is the sort of movement of people and cycles and vehicles. So we've had discussions about a movement strategy, and we've had discussions about ensuring that there's sort of increased potential and increased capacity, so this sort of people can actually move through the space easily and safely without sort of causing any sort of difficulties. So the landscape design incorporates elements of new tree planting within the site itself, green shrub spaces and hedge planting, sort of improved sort of hard surface service areas. We have a sort of a sunken potential sort of seating area akin to potentially sort of the central square of the university. And then we have sort of links through to cycle. We've had a look at some of the design lines on some of the cycle parking, so that's been incorporated into the landscaping scheme. And where we don't want people to move through the space because of it being unsafe or inappropriate in terms of sort of defending planting being created, then we've created sort of areas of shrub planting and other hedge planting to try and direct people. Because at the moment, especially using the cycle parking, people seem to go off in all different directions, so it's trying to manage that arrangement. And then there's also talk about some nominal additional tree replacement, and we're looking here at those being along Cow Drive and other potential locations within the campus itself. But that is part, as mentioned in the report, part of an ongoing discussion in terms of the appropriate numbers for tree replacement to meet our specific tree policy at DM7. And so we're also having further discussion about what's called a green infrastructure strategy for the university to enable us to sort of build in future-proofing and also to build in some biodiversity net gain, which is required to be off-site for this particular location, but also potentially off-site for other future development on campus. So we have a view here looking northwards along University Drive, and you sort of see cycleway coming off. So it's a pink pedalway, which people either come down to the roundabout and then into the cycle parking area, which is just behind me, or cut across onto that main route. And we saw earlier where people come straight into campus. Cyclists can then miss that roundabout and go straight down Chancellor's Drive. So we have the existing cycle area in this location. So the new cycle area is basically in the same area, but would improve landscape and landscape screening. So instead of it being a single tier arrangement, there'll be a two-tier arrangement within this location. We've also had comments from Norwich City Council about this area being improved in terms of providing a clearer and safer and more level access for cyclists as they come, as they do cut into the roundabout and then onto this section of University Drive, and it will be easier for them to cut across. So there's some work still to be done, but we've agreed, like we negotiated through condition, to improve the levels here, and potential whether this needs to be extended in length to incorporate sort of the existing service. What has been sort of a temporary drop-off for the park and ride buses, if that continues, then there's sort of improved access for both cyclists, bus users, and potentially have a better level of removing some of these step areas, improved area access for pedestrians and people with disabilities. So this area of landscaping incorporates the two-tier cycle parking with sort of cut-off landscaping to prevent people cutting through under the trees, and enhanced sort of routes for people, because we know people will come in and want to go out this end to come onto campus, so let's design something to enable that to happen without destroying the landscaping which has been planted in the location. And then within this location, sort of seeing, as mentioned earlier, the top end of the swale feature, we'll providing some sort of the flood attenuation and surface water capture into the future. We've also looked at, because the question has been asked about, well, how do we manage, if you're only re-providing the same number of cycle parking spaces, how do we manage the increased floor space? So at the present time, the intent is that building 6, which is at this end with the teaching wall, once that is decanted into building 3 here, that would remain empty pending its second phase refurbishment. But in the interim, if that didn't happen, then we've asked the university to revisit, because we've granted consent for a substantial amount of cycle parking just next to the congregation hall, and we've also granted a reasonable amount of cycle parking on top of the boiler house. This provided some extra cover for the new science building, building 60 at the end of Chancellor Drive. And we also looked at enhancement through the School of Engineering Productivity East here, through improved covered cycle parking in this location. So these two developments have gained a potential improvement in cycle parking through here and on site here, with, if there was a shortfall potential here, through the Sky House building that we considered 2 or 3 years ago, this consent was secured to enable a larger, more rationalised approach to cycle parking. So it's a 2-phase consent. So if there was a shortfall, then either of these consents could be pulled into use to bring back sort of appropriate levels of cycle parking on campus. One of the other things that we've granted recently is these horrendous temporary fixings because of the difficulties the university were having with the safety of spandrel panels. And spandrel panels are basically large chunks of concrete which form a significant part of the architectural value of the building. They were found to have some metal corrosion in terms of their internal fixings, partly because of water ingress, because of the design of the windows, which we'll mention in a few moments, but also partly because of age. It was becoming a problem in terms of when in sort of high wind conditions or bad weather conditions, then there was a fear that these could become demounted from the building and fall from the building. So as part of a process, a very expensive process for the university, these temporary fixes have secured these elements in place in the short term, and the intent is that these would be removed as each phase of refurbishment went forward to bring the building back to a cleaner, crisper design. Other parts of the proposal include, it says CRU there, which is sort of a mistake, so I apologise. It's this is chemistry, I believe, with some bio research at the end. So this building is Fieldman Mawson in the early 70s, as sort of built out as part of the chemistry connection. The art spur here is Masden. You can see it, so we have the, I think this is bio something in terms of research. So we're now looking at a potential link through this space into the end of the art spur. So we have a sort of a semi-subterranean link for service, and we have the lift access here, and the route which runs back through into this area, which is the west store area, so you can sort of see the art spur. So that Ken building is just behind here, and sort of there is a link, pedestrian link, which comes wide around here, but there also is interconnectivity in terms of service access through this area here. And within this location, we're now looking at a new bin store and saline tank store. The design features here repeat those both on this and on this building. This repeats design details which we've agreed for the Productivity East, and then this building repeats design elements for standardised bin stores in the service ground below the walkway, such as that you see below the ITCS building. The other thing in terms of trees impacts in this locality is the pine stand that we have just to the south side. So if you can imagine you've got a new store going in this location, then we've asked for an agricultural method statement and a no-dig foundation solution. So we would have something sitting on what is sort of semi-existing hard surfacing, but it isn't going into the ground, so if there is any tree roots, then those trees should remain unaffected. So, one of the other issues before us today is the replacement of windows on the building. There's been some initial objection which has been sort of reduced in terms of its observance from various of the heritage bodies. The 20th Century Society, whilst they maintained their objection to the extension, have now removed their objection to the replacement of windows. And Historic England have also downgraded their comments in terms of seeking to require conditions of certain details of the new window scheme. I think the initial problems were because of we had the sort of sash detail, which is an incredibly unusual feature, with then sort of a metal window. All of this is primarily single glazed, and we also have a very fine mullion detail and details within the window that give a sort of bulky, chunky feel. So this is a sort of a recessive architectural feature which is then held within the banding itself. So here we have sort of more of a sense of how that sash works in terms of the mullion detail. And you sort of see here one of the other problems which has been caused part of the decay of the spangle panel fixings is this hidden gutter, which you wouldn't know was there, but all of that drains internally to the building. And you sort of see also here the unfortunate metal fixings because of the problems that this has caused to the fixing of the spangle panels and the over-engineered potentially solution that we've had to agree to enable those to be kept on the building. So the window design itself is important in terms of the sort of the strata detail of the building. It sort of creates a sort of very strong patterning to the elevation. And as you sort of see it in relation to some of the other listed buildings like the Grade 2 ziggurats and the Grade 2 style ziggurats, sorry, and the Grade 2 library, you sort of see the teaching hall as being that bonding relationship behind all of these. So things like spangle panels, roof levels, windows are sort of incredibly important details in terms of understanding not only the master plan, but how those master plan buildings hold themselves together. So we see here an image of a potential sort of window solution, and I think we've got to a point where this is probably close to what we may be looking at as a window replacement, with the exception of a finessed mullion detail on the corner to make that a smaller detail. And we also see here some of the images and some of the things you might have seen on site today in terms of parts of the problems of building corrosion and window corrosion over a long period of time. So we have, moving on, we have a long view from the southeast. So not only is the building important in relation to the harbour and the river valley, but you also see it in its approach from other parts of the campus. So what we're focusing on here is obviously you'll sort of see the bounding of the window, but what also is important is the way that some of these roof elements step out and over and then step down the building. Because if you're trying to screen an enormous amount of plant machinery required for a science faculty, similar to what we had to do with Building 60, then it needs to be something which is reasonably large, but it needs to be designed in a manner which is reasonably recessive. So that creates its own design problems and design questions. So it's a case of, okay, well, if you've got to put all of this on top of a building, and you will see from the north elevation it's been designed in as a separate piece of architecture in a way, with sort of elements of cladding and glass. But on the southern side, it's been sort of trying to be pulled away from the edge and any sort of plant enclosure minimised. And you sort of see here the detail I'm talking about in terms of the stepping and the overhang of the concrete, which is extremely sort of interesting in terms of the building design. But you also then start to see some of the service towers, which again are important in terms of the building design. So you will see from the earlier elevation, we've pulled that back. So whilst there will be some visual relationship, I think it'll be key in terms of how those materials are chosen at the end of the day as to how successful that will be. I'm confident that the university will be able to achieve a scheme which doesn't impact on the relationship with the building and its sort of architectural elements. Certainly from the south side, because I think both Historic England and 20th Century Society see that as being a potential problem. Historic England have not, as such, sort of withdrawn their comment, but they have reduced it in terms of its content, in terms of their acceptance of a sort of screen at roof level. They have, in a way, sort of more aligned themselves, given the changes which were made during the application, to, instead of being a sort of a singular plane of screen on this side of the building, to be more something which is stepped in and out, which then repeats some of the architecture. I think they're comfortable with that type of approach, but again, I think it comes down to the detailing and the material finish at the end of the day. So some of the other sort of key things that we've considered are in terms of heat loss from the building. Many of you may have seen this image before, where the teaching wall glows quite brightly in the dark, as taken from a sort of thermal imaging point of view. The idea through improving sort of building fabric and replacement windows is to reduce that level of impact in terms of heat loss. Which in turn will then help the university in terms of their net zero targets and their ambitions for campus in terms of reducing maintenance and reducing sort of energy costs for themselves. The other thing that you may have seen today is some of the asbestos issues which are prevalent through the building. Some of the strip back to frame is achievable, but through discussion, we suggest that there will retain be elements where the dispandal panels can't be removed, because there's no way that, as a local planning authority, we could see that fabric could be protected and then refitted. But there will be small elements of asbestos, but that asbestos will be sort of hidden within other coverings and other new lines of insulation within the building. The other thing we've talked about is the addition of telecoms on the roof of the building. We've asked, as part of the mitigation, that those telecoms are removed. which will then simplify certainly this particular tower as you see it, which will then offset some of the other impacts that may be seen in terms of putting new plant and new screening at roof level. So I think that apparently is the slideshow done. So I'll take you back to an overview image. And we'll just say, in terms of recommendation, the conditions or suggested conditions which may be subject to further negotiation if there are other details which are required or if other things have been resolved before we issue a decision. The approval of planning permission conditions are 55 onwards and the grant of Mr. Byrne consent conditions are 56 onwards. I think overall, as per section 66 of the Mr. Building Conservation Areas Act, the planning authorities have special regard to the desirability of preserving the building, its setting and features of special architectural historic interest. We've looked, there's no photos here before you today of the interiors of the building. I think there is importance in terms of the interior fabric. Some of that can be retained and some of that can be redesigned in a manner which provides a sort of a uniformity of design across the entirety of the wall. If you go through the wall, there have been some unfortunate additions which we would hope to see removed and rectified as the four-phase refit comes forward. And in its place, we would hope there will be sort of established a principle of type of refit that we've seen within the Institute of Productivity, where we've repeated some of the core and internal petition features. We've looked at some of the features for both Field and Lawson and Laston being repeated within those spaces. And we've also looked at how we can sort of reuse some of the timber fabric in either furniture or other elements on campus. So whilst that fabric is removed, it is reinterpreted and reused within the building to continue the story of Laston and Field and Lawson. I think as such, given the great way to conserve assets in line with historic England, we've concluded that there is less than substantial harm from the works as proposed. And from the evidence provided in terms of financial liability that the university goes through in terms of maintaining the building, also its future maintenance, and trying to maintain the reputation of the university and protect its sort of future usability of the building in terms of science and research, certainly at this stage. From the evidence which we have seen, I think the public benefits on balance outweigh any harm which is caused. Overall, it provides an enhanced educational facility and helps to de-risk the teaching role and the future of the campus, really, because it's a big chunk, it's a big building. If all of this building failed, then it would have significant implications for the university. And I think this is the first phase in ensuring that something like that doesn't happen and the university continue as a successful institution within Norwich and across the country and other parts of the world. In line with policy and the MPPF, it represents sustainable development, and the recommendation is to approve as per the conditions as suggested and grant Mr. Byrne consent again as per the conditions as suggested.
Thank you, Lee, for that. That's very good. I have granted someone to speak for the UEA or the applicant or the agent, and you have 3 minutes, but I wouldn't cut you dead off if you needed correction, but not too much.
Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity to address the committee today. I am Stephen Wells, the Director of Estates and Facilities at UEA. I would first like to thank the officers for their engagement culminating in the proposals in front of you today. Our amazing campus is a very unique facility for our students, staff and our wider community. The Laston Mall is suffering condition issues which could result in catastrophic building failure, which could impact specialist science facilities and our world-leading research. This could have the potential to disable approximately 48% of our estate overnight if not addressed. The primary driver of the proposal is to respond to the now critical condition of the Lasdon Wall, whilst providing an extension that delivers modern and flexible laboratory environments to support our world-leading research. Studies undertaken by the university have confirmed that significant risks to the building fabric and services are imminent, some of which have already become apparent by the £8 million programme of emergency recently undertaken to provide temporary support to the spandrel panels of the building facade. I would like to highlight a number of areas in the limited time that I have, these being heritage, sustainability and landscaping. Regarding heritage, whilst the university acknowledges its historic beginnings, the heritage and its iconic Lasdon buildings that must be respected, we also must look ahead as Lasdon intended and adapt these buildings to meet future needs. With your approval, the iconic building will continue to have a future viable use at the centre of our UEA community, leaving it fit to provide both an excellent student experience and world-leading research facilities for the first time and accessible entrance. Regarding sustainability, the proposed development would also see commencement of the upgrading of the thermal performance of the Lasdon Wall, an essential part of the university's net zero carbon ambitions, a building that currently accounts for 20% of the university's building-related emissions. Our amazing campus, the campus environment, is critical to the ongoing attractiveness of the university. At the heart of this is the green infrastructure that surrounds the built environment. Tree planting is an important aspect of this. The university has planted over 250 additional trees, a net increase of 169, with further tree planting now proposed by this scheme. So in conclusion, we expect the investment in the Lasdon Wall to cost many hundreds of millions to complete all 4 refurbishment phases, to safeguard the legacy of these historic structures. When you take into account condition, asbestos, the challenges of net zero and the functional needs of our academic community, not only are there no other viable options, but all of these elements coincide to require substantial strip back to frame and retention of the existing structure. Not least the embodied carbon in the existing structure and all those historic elements, including spandrel panels, which will be retained by these proposals. In conclusion, the scheme before you is one we believe represents a sustainable, viable and deliverable solution to safeguard the future of the Lasdon Wall. For the reasons outlined in the officer's report, there is a clear and convincing justification to grant planning permission and that the public benefit of the scheme outweigh the less than substantial harm to the heritage asset. I therefore urge this committee to approve this application in accordance with the officer's recommendation so that the university may deliver this much needed high quality refurbishment and extension of the Lasdon Wall. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We'll move on to questions from members to the planning officer. Any questions, anyone? Councillor Graham?
With so much glass, how will the building will heat be kept in summer? And just as important, how will the building be cooled? And ventilated, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, it's an existing problem. At the present time, teaching all overheats, as you probably know, and is required the use of a sort of film material on the south side, which is something which is less than acceptable in terms of design, and it probably doesn't function terribly well. So the idea at the present time is that through the replacement windows on the south side, we'll be looking at the type of glazing to give these the low E value in terms of transmittance of heat into the building. They've suggested, we've asked for natural ventilation, but the suggestion is because of the specific nature of research and science investigation, that these spaces need to be hermetically sealed in a way. So you're not getting sort of random people just opening a window while somebody's doing an experiment. So it's going to be using mechanical ventilation throughout the building. On the north side of the building, in terms of heat gain, that isn't going to be such a problem because obviously it's existing shading. Through heat loss, I think we'll be looking at whilst there will be some, because of the extent of glazing, because it's inherent in the design of the building, so there will be some reduction in terms of double glazing or other triple glazing elements if that's possible. Improved glass, but the main heat retention is going to be through improved building fabric. So you'll be insulating on the inside of the concrete. There will be a certain strip back of key features, and then within places like the bays and within external walls, you'll be overcladding the concrete with improved levels of insulation. So the calculation has been done. I think there is some discussion as to the percentage improvements on some of the sustainable construction section. So there is a sort of a fabric first betterment, which is sort of mentioned, I think, at paragraph 186. There's some benefits in terms of concrete mass and embodied heat within the building, which can be reused at 187. Yeah, it aligns potentially with sort of the idea that you have a scope 1, scope 2 reduction in emissions across campus. But it has to be done because of the very nature of this through mechanical means and building insulation improvement.
Thank you. I've got one telephone mast on the top, and they're proposed to go into a tower somewhere on the site. Do we know where that is roughly going to go there?
We've initially discussed that with the university, and they've come up with sort of 5 suggestions, 4 of which we've said are unacceptable. The one which potentially has options to continue would be a location within the main car park. It's reasonably screened by the interior building at the present time, which is quite a large building at the east end, so you could have something accommodated within that space. It's also within reasonable distance of the existing location on top of the teaching wall. It also gives benefit that we potentially could see the removal of further telecoms equipment on top of the library if that building needs a refurbishment in the future. But it does seem to be feasible, and it does seem to be a location which causes least visual impact or other harms within the locality.
Thank you. Any other questions, anyone? Councillor Stupin.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Both the C20 Society and Historic England appear to maintain their objections based on the what they say is a substantial harm to a historic listed building. So that relates to the 2 extensions along that wall that they say is of importance. So can you explain in more detail why you think that is less than substantial harm, and perhaps also expand on the wider benefit to Norwich and beyond from the extensions and the new facilities, so that we can have a more balanced, or so that we can look at how to balance out those negative impacts, please.
Yeah. The 2 heritage bodies have commented. The 20th Century Society believe it to be substantial harm, and they maintain their objection to the extension. The Historic England comments are that they don't wholeheartedly object to the proposal, and they conclude that all of these elements, all of these cumulative elements of extensions, refurbishment, plant machinery, replacement windows, in totality result in less than substantial harm. So we would align ourselves in that conversation in terms of Historic England, who are a statutory body for such things, and take on board their comments and advice. Their particular concern about the extension is the way that the new extension sort of screens. We have a photograph of that, maybe. Yeah, their concern is that at the present time, this is a relatively untouched original element of Lasden, which, because it's within an area, has its own distinct architectural character. And their preference would be that the university would investigate the idea of a second wall as providing the facilities. So through discussion with the architect and the agent, we've asked them to look at how they reduce those elements of loss and those elements which are retained in terms of maintaining visibility. So we still have a certain element of visibility of the service tower. And we also have a degree of retention in terms of the original north elevation of the teaching wall. So you could still interpret in a way what was there previously. So what we're doing here, so we've come to the conclusion what we're doing here is something that Laston, I sort of mentioned that in the report as well. Laston would have had to potentially at some point consider, and has considered on other of his buildings, how you could extend them. So we've asked the architect not to mimic Laston, but to come up with a new solution, much along the lines of what you see at the BMRC by RH Partnership. That covers part of the north elevation of the wall, and that end of the wall could have been seen in a way in a similar relationship to this end of the wall as being sort of a relatively untouched element of building within a sort of a landscape setting. So we've asked for as much of the original building to be kept clear, so the archspur and elements of this north elevation have been kept clear. So it brings down the level of harm. And in terms of then, how do you balance out public benefit? So the public benefit, I think the 5 pillars of the university's case are given at page 33 of the report. And I'll just say, give the headline comment from the university. So the refurbishment must meet the academic needs of the university. All condition issues must be addressed to provide a future viable use of the building. Asbestos must be fully removed from all internal areas. The refurbishment must provide an essential contribution to achieving net zero carbon. The scheme must be affordable within the tight capital constraints of the university and within the context of the condition of the wider university estate. So to each of those I've provided commentary as to what we can and can't accept in terms of balancing out the public benefit against the harm which is caused. So through negotiation we would agree with the Historic England that it is less than substantial harm, and we've seen, whilst we can't take, because of the comments I make about net zero carbon and its sort of relationship to existing planning policy, and the primacy of the Listed Building Conservation Areas Act in that regard, we've suggested that we would look certainly at the sort of the benefits of maintaining the university as a beneficial function for the city of Norwich and for Norfolk. The cost implications of maintaining the building in its sort of current form, the millions of pounds they have to spend each year in terms of monitoring asbestos and hoping to reduce the amount of asbestos with the building, and that which can't be concealed is then sort of hidden and is not part of sort of an accessible function. At the present time you'll have seen within the service area somebody has to do a replacement of a piece of equipment, and the danger is there is asbestos there that has to be treated before they can continue. So if that is all taken out of the equation, that's in terms of balanced against the public benefit. And if the university is saving money in terms of how much they spend in doing this type of activity year on year and keeping the building in a probably an underperforming state going forward, then that money could be better spent in refurbishing the entirety of the wall and for other expansion of university facilities for the betterment of City Norfolk, the country. It also, stepping aside from that conversation, reputationally for the university, being a leader in carbon reduction, I think will be incredibly important in terms of showing a building which is sort of showing its improved credentials I'm looking at a 20th century piece of architecture, and possibly an approach that others could take to 20th century architecture could again be a side argument, but that wouldn't be part of the primacy of our public benefit argument. But the public benefit argument is set out, and we align ourselves with historic England in terms of the impact which is caused. That covers the question.
Councillor Stookie, did you want to just come back on that?
Yes, thank you. Well, just I note that Historic England does state in their opening paragraph that it's less than substantial harm. But members should note that they do conclude that they wouldn't support the application as it stands, and they refer to harm to the architectural and historic significance of the Grade 2 listed teaching wall itself. We have the public benefit, which I'm grateful for you explaining in more detail. Also, I had a question about trees. I'd be interested to hear from other members who attended this morning what they feel about the significance of the trees that will be lost. I understand there's some Category B trees amongst them. And again, I'd like some more detail, if possible, about the replanting, the location of the replanting, and whether the numbers will exceed those that are lost, and there's the sort of the timescale to achieving a balance.
The quality of trees is set out 115. Paragraph 115, location and size is discussed at paragraph 116. At present, we've looked at this in two ways. We've looked at this in terms of biodiversity net gain, and we've had a look at the biodiversity metric and taken a calculation in terms of tree replacement type, existing type, and benefit in terms of its species to the wider ecology of the area. At the present time, there's sort of some London planes and some other types of tree species which are probably less than beneficial in terms of improved habitat for this area of the campus. So we're looking at sort of more native species and improved pollinators. And within this indication, you can see some replacement tree planting is proposed potentially within the swale, but we've also looked at other locations on the campus and within this area for improving some planting along Camp Drive. At the present time, based solely on the metric, the 9 trees lost are replaced by 9 trees which will provide betterment over a 30-year period. In terms of policy DM7 and biomass replacement, we've also done an independent calculation using the metric itself, which indicates, and I think an indication is given, that we'll be looking for paragraph 118, looking at potentially 52 trees replaced across the campus. We've also looked at where other trees have been replaced because of enabling works and consents which have been granted and part implemented, where trees have been taken out but not replaced, and we've asked the university to investigate that for us. So this all comes down to looking at the green infrastructure strategy, and we would suggest that incorporated within that is an audit of trees across campus, so we have an idea of what the benchmark position is, and then we work on top of that. So the idea would be, through this proposal, we would be looking for 52 replacements on campus, which would include those 9 which are immediately part of the proposal to meet our policy. And that would form part of a strategy going forward to ensure that we don't end up in a position where we're double counting things or we're putting things where we know the university will want to build in a few years' time. We've had that in the past where we've planted trees and within a space of 2, 3, 5 years we've got an application in and those trees are gone. So whilst there is a short-term benefit of a small tree capturing carbon, long-term that doesn't really answer the problem of ensuring what is already a beautiful campus, and I can't take away from that. And we've gone through landscape assessment of the campus, and we contacted Historic England and went through a process of assessing landscape areas and whether or not this should form part of a historic park. And the conclusion of that was it didn't meet the criteria for being a historic park, but is important, especially in terms of the work of Goldman and others in terms of creating this landscape setting. So the intent, the university are on board with this. I understand that they move forward with their green infrastructure strategy, and then we have conversations about how we can sort of ensure that we have a baseline figure for trees and the number of trees in addition to those which are being provided for this application on and slightly off-site for the one-for-one replacement also capture the TM7 requirement for the 52 total trees across campus.
Councillor.
Thank you. And thank you, Lee, for the really good explanation of why you think with the Heritage England and the 20th Century Society, why they object and why, putting in context the other issues that we should take into account and the 5 principles of the development. I think that was really very helpful. And I did find it quite surprising that it was only English Heritage and Heritage England and the 20th Century Society. They were the only 2 objections. There were no other objections. We had more objections for McDonald's on Mousehold Lane than we had for this. So I think you must be doing something right. Well, you're obviously doing a lot right. Going back to the issue of the trees, I think it's a great opportunity that the university are going to do that survey and baseline assessment. But I think it's also an opportunity, perhaps, to look at the habitats of the whole area, because it is the loss of habitat really that is reducing the biodiversity. And I mean, I don't know if I heard this right, but the swale that's going to be there, is there an opportunity to make sure that that is not just a drainage area, but something more than that you know, does increase biodiversity and, you know, somewhere for people to enjoy, you know, a social place as well. And then are there other opportunities to increase biodiversity? I thought I heard something about some net gain taking place off-site. But that didn't seem quite right, because, you know, there's so many opportunities here to increase biodiversity, but we haven't heard too much about that. So that's one point. But the other point was that this is going to actually increase...
Long questions, if you just walk in the
This is going to increase floor space by what, 2,674 square metres, and this is just this development. With the other three phases of development coming afterwards, will it eventually trickle down into an increase in number of students attending the university as a result of these increases in floor space with these developments? That was my question.
I'll quickly have an overview of the biodiversity net gain. So I think we're looking at a 1% increase actually within the red line area. So the swale feature here is sort of almost in a way sort of surface water attenuation feature, so it slows down surface water being discharged in the area. That will be planted, and the intention is that it's planted, and it will be adjacent to a walkway area, so it becomes part of the immediate setting as an extension. I think if it was just sort of a series of crates stopping water with a piece of grass on top, then that would be not an interesting feature and not really a beneficial feature. So we've asked for that to form part of the biodiversity net gain. The other net gain proposals are slightly outside So they aren't off campus, they're on campus, but they are within other areas close by, so there'll be improvements close by. Part of the green infrastructure strategy will look at the campus in its entirety. We've also, through discussion, looked at those linked county wildlife sites, which are immediate adjacent, and some sites which straddle the university and other areas south of the river, and certainly our own areas along Violet Grove and Elm Park. We sort of try to open up a conversation with the university to say, well, how can we manage all of this area, rather than cherry picking areas, but we look at it as an entirety. And hopefully the strategy will then link in with our own green infrastructure strategy, which is coming forward to improve betterment across the entirety of the city. In terms of increased floor space, yes, the extension increases floor space for this building. The building 6, science building, will be decanted into this building, so immediately there will be no increase of accommodation on campus. The idea would be, at some point in the future, everything catches up, and there will probably be other monies coming forward for other development. Now, within the current 2010 Development Framework Strategy, within the 2019 update, which was part of the evidence base for the TNLP, we've set a sort of desirable level of floor space capacity increase across the campus. So we would expect there to be an increase in student numbers. Likewise, we've aligned that with our own policies in terms of student accommodation within the city centre. We've also provided some allocations or suggested allocations on campus for additional student accommodation within the campus itself. So I think any increase will be managed through the DFS and the DFS update. Beyond that, we would look at the immediate control because of, okay, well, how do we manage things like cycle parking and accessibility, movement strategies? Well, we would condition that if Building 6 was reoccupied, then we need to revisit those things because there may well be a shortfall on campus which needs to be sort of reviewed and taken up and improved upon. So I think it's certainly being managed through policy, and I'm sort of confident that the extension here should be capable of being accommodated on campus.
Councillor?
Yes, thank you for that. So there's no actual numbers that you could put on that sort of
It's
increase.
year on year. Numbers at the campus are down to its competitiveness across the entirety of the age group who are entering university. So they're competing for all those 18 plus people who want to go to university. So if science moves from building 6, which is fully occupied, into this building and it's fully occupied, then logically there should be sort of a levelling up of figures. The other thing to remember is that the university are also looking at COVID-19 impacts and how they sort of arrange their staff and whether they need to be on site or whether they need to be teaching remotely or doing things remotely, and some of these sort of the other admin functions. How much of that needs to be on site? Some of the estates functions, do you need to be in the office? So, in a way, over the recent years, student population and other population on campus has slightly decreased because of COVID-19. Moving forward, if everything went back to normal this year, then we would look at how we control that capacity issue in the short term. Long term, there should be other policy allowances to enable that to happen.
On a very simple level, we used to have a situation where when there was an increase in numbers, because we were giving up planning application approval, then it used to trigger some monies coming through to the local areas to deal with the increase in students. And we're not talking about cycle parking, we're actually talking about permit parking for areas around the university. That was a very simple sort of thing to understand, that they were going to build something, increase the numbers, and so therefore there was a bit of money coming over to pay for the impact that would have on the local area. But you're saying we're not in that sort of simple game at the moment, but we might be back to that at some time. But you think policy will provide for that?
I think that's not really a question to do with the application. Is that correct, David?
Insofar as if it did increase numbers, I think I'm hearing this doesn't increase numbers, but further down the line, this will allow numbers to be increased if money's. So I'm just trying to sort of.
Well, if you said that in the discussion after we had the questions, we'd be interrupted the meeting.
It's pretty relatively simple thing to answer. So I'll just quickly come back in terms of the Section 106 agreement. We've looked at this and concluded that it's not reasonable to ask for a Section 106 contribution, probably because of the reason you're giving in terms of accommodation increase. With the Enterprise Centre, we did ask for a contribution on that scheme because it fell outside of the allocated campus at that time. Was new floor space, and we had a contribution submitted which increased the area of controlled parking zone further northward within the adjacent council estate. So that built on, so originally we had contributions for the areas to the east, and then we built on that boundary for the CPZ to move further northwards through the Enterprise Centre. But we've had other monies in the past in terms of feeding into sort of improvements, the cycle links, the Pink Pedalway, and other monies came forward and was used to improve that cycle link from city centre through. There may be need in the future to do other improvements along Bluebell Road, which may need to come through Section 106 requirements from other new development outside the scope of existing policy.
Councillor Champion.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a few questions, but my first question would be in relation to the roof of the building. When I was looking at the roof of the building, we talked about the net gain of biodiversity. It strikes me there's a lot of space on the roof that could be used for green roof structures, which means within the red line, which we were saying there was only 1% increase in biodiversity, there would be the possibility that the university could be exemplary and lead the way in relation to increasing urban space biodiversity increase. I think that the university's got an ideal opportunity here to be leading the way, and I think the fact that they've got lots of green space on their site is being used as a way of offsetting. I think they could, I just feel like, am I wrong in that assessment? Is there not lots of unused roof space? Have I misinterpreted the diagrams?
Yeah, put it blankly. There's no room on the roof. It's something that we have a conversation with university on a regular basis, either green roof, brown roof, other types of roof. They have resisted those in the past and they have accepted those in the past. We have two good successes, which are relatively small. We have a good brown roof at the building 60, which is a small ancillary building within the grounds of that building. And we have a small success in terms of a green roof, in terms of one of the bus stops along University Drive. So anything like that we will push for. If it's achievable, then we will try and make it happen. But from the plan, which we've got at the present time, the front part of the roof is covered primarily with PV panels, and the back part of the roof is covered primarily by large chunks of extract equipment and air source heat pumps, which need a certain amount of mobility for other people to come in and service and replace and do other things. If it was possible, then we would have asked for. So it's beneficial in terms of the swale feature and features like that within a very constrained site that we have some betterment. 1% betterment within the red line is difficult to achieve within this sort of area, but pushing for other betterment across the campus. The other thing to mention is that we've had a word with the tree officer on campus and asked him to look at when he fells any trees which had to be removed, and that timber is reused on campus. It either form part of new furniture, outside furniture across campus, or goes into sort of little vernacular habitats, log piles, etc., or actually goes into physically enabling engineering works to things like the broad edge to ensure you have a natural material rather than a concrete material retaining parts of the broad and other flood areas. So if I could, I would, but unfortunately I can't.
Thank you. If it's okay, can I ask one more question then? Thank you, Chair. So another issue which maybe I'd like some clarification with is relation. So firstly, you've decided not to allow any grey water use within the building, and I'm unsure why that has been decided. It seems I couldn't see any reasoning for that. And then the second issue is so the swale seems like a very good way of handling the water runoff. But I noticed in the document it talks about that the chalk layers underneath the subterranean chalk layers were such that they could be eroded and allow for contamination of the aquifer. And this struck me as, and I read further on that the suds would be lined to prevent this occurring. If we have increased rainfall, which we are going to have with relation to climate change, have these been considered in relation to this development? Thank you.
Yeah, if you look at paragraph 183 in the report, I say that grey water recycling has been scattered along with rainwater harvesting for the moment, with the exception of external water capture within the suds basements, but could be included in future upgrades if the solution was practical without excessive maintenance. So there's a very low bar, unfortunately, within JCS Policy 3 in terms of water conservation. And it only needs to meet sort of relatively low levels as set by building control and other people. Grey water recycling, if we could achieve it, would be a good thing to put back. With previous schemes, the university had pushed back and said, no, it's too expensive and doesn't work, and is how do we then incorporate it into a scheme? But the door has been left open for when we look at the solutions for water capture to enable that to happen. If not necessary in terms of the function of the building, then certainly in terms of the function of maintaining the landscape. In terms of the suds feature, because of the chalk underlying aquifer and issues of chalk dissolution, then we wouldn't want surface water going into the ground because you're going to potentially transfer pollutants into the aquifer. And you're also probably going to undermine the stability of the chalk and the substrata. So the feature is lined to enable immediate capture and some use within the swale. It then feeds into an underground crate system. From that crate system there could potentially be options for it to be pumped and reused with other parts of landscaping, but we haven't investigated yet. It's probably something to talk through on the details application stage. The other beneficial thing that we're pushing for is that below any hard surface area you also have additional water capture. So you need to probably, within sort of parking areas, push that through a petrol interceptor or a contaminant interceptor and then feed that into your main holding tank and then see what your options are for discharge. The size of the tank will be obviously through discussion with Anglia Water in terms of the rate of discharge into the existing surface water system, but there could be options, as I say, for it to be pumped and used for other things. I've left the door open in terms of the wording of the report, and it will be down to the detail in the day.
If I may, Chair, can I just come back on that? It strikes me that we're talking about the reason we've currently got nutrient neutrality ruling is because we've got a biochemical crisis going on the planet. And it strikes me that this is sort of like we've got around this with a technicality, that because it's not overnight dwelling, that this issue isn't being fully addressed. Whereas it strikes me that this, again, is an opportunity for the university to be really showing the world that we can be leading and would be an opportunity maybe to attract new students and the wider academic community and environmentalists and everyone else by addressing this more directly. I don't know if I've misinterpreted that, but it strikes me that there would be contaminant pollution.
That sounds like a big bit of discussion to me,
Yeah.
not just a question. Did you want to come back on that, Ian? Or?
Yeah, I'll just quickly, we've
Sure.
covered off neutrality issues within the report. I mean, Natural England advice, paragraph 145, I believe, indicates the advice they're giving. If they're saying that commercial activities are screened out of the requirement for, improvement, then we can't do anything other than follow the advice. We've had a look at the types of accommodation, and none of those would appear to be captured by the Natural England advice. Yes, from a personal point of view, pollution, etc., is an issue, but the pollution and contamination is mentioned within this report in terms of transference of contaminants from potentially contaminated existing ground soils, etc., within the locality. So if you've got, if you have an area of existing mound and open space, that mound must have come from somewhere. That could have been created as part of the original golf course on this site. It could have been formed through dumping of building materials whilst they constructed a teaching wall in the 1960s. It could be full of asbestos and other things that you wouldn't want to see being filtrated into your aquifer, which is why we're suggesting that splitting those two things out, that there is potential contamination, but that contamination can be dealt with through appropriate management of construction activities on site and ensuring that you don't introduce an inappropriate form of surface water drainage into the aquifer or into the underlying chalk. If nutrient neutrality issues change in the future, or if the government advice changes, then we will, as development goes forward for other parts of the campus, we will review and take appropriate actions.
Councillor Graham, did you want to come in? No? Question? Not discussion?
But my point's been raised.
Thank you. Councillor Sands? Sue?
Yeah, good one. Thank you, Chair. Okay, I've had a quick look, well, I've had a long look at this actually now, and with all the information we've received today as well as the site visit, it's been made a lot clearer to me. So, my question is this, okay, this is going to further the academic needs of the university. So, the main areas as I see it at the moment, and I'll get the question at the end for you, that's okay. It's got, the UEA has a certain amount of money, a certain amount of budget that it can use, and the academic needs need to be furthered. We're looking at student comfort and facilities, and having had a son that's actually been in those rooms, in the hot and the cold, I know what they can be like. This is a reinvestment. So, given that, I think I'm correct, that those stays, temporary stays cost about £8 million, is that right? Okay, my question is this, have you got a ballpark figure if this doesn't go ahead? So, no further advancement for the UEA, no further real improvement in the learning areas, but a lot of money having been spent. Whereas, as I look at the way I look at it at the moment, money that is being reinvestment is going to improve it. We've got an idea of just how much it's going to cost just to kind of like keep going as we're going, not changing anything and trying to maintain the buildings as they are.
Yes, as part of the process, we've asked the university to share sensitive financial information. So I personally do have a ballpark figure, which I'm not sure, I need to take advice from David as to whether I could sort of release that. There is a high level figure in terms of ongoing yearly maintenance that we've had a look at and sort of considered in terms of beneficial reuse of resources and funding. But I defer to David as to whether we can give any specific information, and then I would probably need to defer to the university as to the exact annual figure, because I have an idea of how many millions that is in my mind, which hopefully isn't too far. Yeah.
Just to come in on that, I think it's not necessarily the amount of money that's spent, but I mean, as the university have already pointed out in their presentation, the doing nothing is essentially not a sustainable option. There are safety issues for the building. As far as the panels are concerned, there are also safety issues in terms of their maintenance of the building. If something isn't done, and potentially the building isn't used, and that's kind of yeah, basically, you potentially, if you don't do what's being proposed, you can potentially lose the building as an active space.
As opposed to having an investment.
Oh, yeah, okay. We had enough questions, I believe. No one else put their hand up. Another question, Ian? Straight question, no discussion or afterwards or before, just a question?
Yes, I have a few, please, yeah. Just going back to heritage, English heritage, sorry, it's, let's find the correct page, bear with me. So the Historic England objection is maintained, and the C20 Society. Just for the benefit of myself and other members, what weighting should we give to those objections, please? And also, have they been denied any information that we have subsequently seen, so that they would potentially have a different view? Or in other words, do they have everything before them that we've had? Further question is about the green infrastructure strategy. Will that be going ahead regardless of this decision today? Were other sites considered, and why were they rejected? And in terms of the discussion just now, the question just now about the costings, presumably this building can be updated without the extension. Can you just confirm that, please?
Yeah, we'll probably defer to David in a second about the weight that we're giving to any individual consultee response. But there is a separation between the two in terms of their importance, in terms of heritage advice, and they are giving two slightly separate. So whilst the Historic England say they cannot support the application, they don't use the word object within their response, and they conclude that it's less than substantial harm. In terms of why this location, well, it's this location because it's a strategy that the university wished to pursue to enable a de-risk of the building in the most logical manner possible. At the present time, there's a high risk to science and research. There's a low risk to humanities. So if you think, okay, well, which of those do I need to rehouse in an appropriate, improved, functioning building in the future, then it would be the science, and that would go into a part of the building, the arts end of the building, which is building 3, which is largely humanities. The only close by science is part of a future phase of refurbishment, which will be chemistry, and the low-level single-storey chemistry area is largely unaffected by this proposal because the new access into the arts spur avoids contact with that building. So why here? It's all about strategy, de-risking future viability of the university. GIS, would the GIS go ahead? Well, I would hope it would go ahead, personally, because I think the university have committed to doing that, and they are, as I say, sort of a good maintainer of their estate in terms of its green function and its sort of presence within the city of Norwich. It's a green edge to the city, which they have protected over a long period of time. Whether it goes ahead immediately is probably reasonably related to this application, because if we are conditioning a relationship to a landscaping and tree replacement scheme to a green infrastructure strategy, then it would push that strategy to come forward sooner. So there are benefits in terms of pursuing that type of condition through this consent. And if I defer to David in terms of the weighting to be given.
Thank you. I mean, there's two elements, I think, to the answer to the question. First of all, there's a duty placed upon us as the council in exercising our decision-making powers to have special regard to the desirability of preserving the character of a listed building. We've done that as officers in the report, and the weight, and then the second part of that is whether or not we accept that there's harm caused to the character of the building. The issue is whether or not it's substantial or less than substantial. The 20th century society, I think, would have it that it is substantial harm. If it is that level, then that level of harm should only be inflicted upon a building in truly exceptional circumstances. We don't, as officers, believe that it is substantial harm, and Historic England, as the government statutory consultee on listed buildings. I should also point out that this is a grade 2 listed building. There's 2 grades of listed building above this, it's grade 2 star and grade 1. And normally Historic England wouldn't be a consultee on a grade 2 listed building. It's because of one. This is a fairly unique grade 2 listed building in some respects. But notwithstanding that, Historic England conclude that the harm to the character of this listed building is less than substantial. I think Lee has been through the reasons why we consider it's less than substantial in terms of the design solution that the university have adopted in their final scheme. I think it's also important to point out that neither the 20th Century Society nor Historic England carry out the planning balance. That's for us to do. They haven't looked at the public benefit of this proposal. They have simply looked at the impact upon, we're not going to downplay them, they're single issue society, consultees. Their sole concern is the impact upon the heritage asset. So in their responses, they haven't weighed anything against that harm. That is for us, the council as the decision-making authority to do. So yeah, you have to attach weight to that. There's no real indication as to whether in national policy as to the weight that you do provide for that. That's for the decision maker to determine. However, you cannot simply ignore it. You have they are both experts in their field. But what we are allowed to do is, in the event that we consider is less than substantial harm, and that's what we consider, we are then allowed to weigh the public benefits against that harm. And that is what we have done in the report. Members may take a different view, but our assessment of the harm aligns with Historic England's assessment of the harm. We have then done the balancing act and concluded that the public benefits, for the reasons Lee's already explained, outweigh that harm.
Thank you.
If I just add to that Historic England have also looked at the impact in relation to the master plan. So they've looked at it in relation to the ziggurats, the library, the walkways, the view from the south, the view from the north, and they've split their response in terms of each of those elements, in terms of windows, extension, and the plant room screen. So then in terms of the design of the extension, they're complementary about the design of the extension. They're complementary about the approach taken by the architect. They are sort of solely basing a concern in that location because of the covering of a reasonably unaltered part of the Aston Wall at the present time.
Thank you. No more questions. I'm going to move on to discussion from members, but before I do that, the recommendation is to approve, and I move that without seconder. Thank you, Councillor Sands. Discussion, Councillor Graham.
Thank you. Clearly this building needs refurbishing and that will happen, whatever. So even if we were to turn this application down, they would have to come back with something better. I think that would be a huge waste of resources and a risk to whatever funding has already been secured. I think we can make it better anyway, and I would like to propose that we condition in that the something about thermal insulation of the glazing, so it could be triple in most places, but like I'm no expert, so I don't want to tie people down to something that's not realistic, so I want to explore the best possible glazing options, including natural ventilation in areas where it wouldn't be a problem. So I can see why they'd want to be flexible and make any space potentially a laboratory, but where a space isn't a laboratory, then then windows could be open and natural ventilation could presumably be used. And the other mitigating condition would be to look again at the potential for using roof space in combination with solar panels, which is great that they're doing. I think the application is very good, it could be better, and we could help to make it better with those conditions.
Councillor Sands.
Thank you, Chair. The 20th Century Society seems to object to extensions and changes to the Aston Wall, but we need to keep in mind that buildings are not static. They are dynamic constructions which need to be changed and adapted over time, which has been a process going on with constructions in thousands of locations for centuries. If this doesn't happen, and the buildings no longer fit for purpose here fall into potential disuse, decay, and ultimately ruin, we end up losing an asset to the city and obviously to the university. In fact, it would have enormous impact on the university, perhaps bringing into question the university's very viability in its current location. In 2010, Scientific American produced what they called their Urban Edition, and one of the points they made in this was that in extending urban and cityscapes was far more sustainable rather than building new, because there was a 75% saving in costs. And we're looking at a similar sort of thing here. To sort of build new would be of immense cost. You've got to break new ground, put all sorts of new infrastructure in. What we're talking about here is upgrading and developing what we already have and providing extensions, which is going to be ultimately a far more sustainable and far more cost-effective alternative than the alternative, building new. So, yeah, I fully support these proposals.
Vaughan Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to thank Lee for a very comprehensive presentation. The word brilliant is not inappropriate, I think. And I'd have to declare, it's not an interest, but UEA is the reason why I'm sat here, and I know someone else who sat here. We have 5 sons, 3 of them went to UEA, one after the other. And it's brilliant to see UEA developing, evolving, and I'd support Councillor Sands in what he says. Buildings develop, things change, and we need to recognise that. I'm all for history and the heritage, I really am, but it's good to see UEA moving into the 21st century to be able to meet the needs of 21st century students. We need it in buckets, quite frankly, in Norwich. I support this.
Councillor Champion?
I likewise, I'm in Norwich. I arrived here 20 years ago to attend the UEA, so I've got a lot to thank the university for. And the university's motto, do different, and I feel like they are holding up and doing their end of the bargain. Their commitment to reach 80% net gain of carbon, to cut their carbon by 80% in the next 8 years with low and zero carbon technology is commendable. I would say that whilst it's unfortunate there would be a loss of 9 trees, the 52 trees, and then that's not including all the additional trees, so that's also commendable. The embedded carbon, which is going to be positive for climate change, again, the improved cycle routes, the biodiversity net gain. I'm sure we could discuss ways of improving that slightly further. I think that, the swale, and the improvement of the prevention of heat loss through the windows. This is, I don't see how, this is brilliant, and I think you guys should be commended, and we should be very proud that we've got the UEA in Norwich, and I fully support this, and I'd encourage everyone else to do as well.
Councillor Lovett?
Yes, I'm very pleased to hear the previous 3 speakers, and all I would say that I too believe this is an exciting new phase for the UEA in creating a new building, but whilst retaining the historic fabric of the old one. I feel that the public benefits outweigh any substantial harm and allows the UEA to continue as a successful university, benefiting future students, but also benefiting Norwich as a whole. So I should be voting in favour.
Okay, anyone else? Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd also like to thank Lee for the presentation and the report and the detailed answers that you've given. Because it's been quite important for me to come to the conclusion I have. I do think that this is a rather excellent design. Clearly there is some harm to the heritage asset, but I think it is outweighed by the wider benefits. I'm slightly uncomfortable that some fairly good quality trees will be removed to produce this, and especially as there's a climate research unit replacing them, it seems a little ironic. But on balance, I think this is a good project, and I wish the UEA well with
it. Someone else? Yes, Paul Thomas. No, Viv Thomas, sorry. Paul's in this show.
Thank you, Chair. I've listened to the information and enjoyed the tour, which was very helpful. And I also think that on balance, it's an excellent project and it definitely ought to go ahead and it will benefit the students enormously. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with what nearly everyone has said today. There could be a little bits of improvement on bits and pieces, but overall I think it's really good for Norwich to actually get into that building and make it better for the 21st century. The people have said this is going to benefit the students, it's going to benefit Norwich. Most of the students who come to UEA live in this area afterwards and don't disappear. So if we can keep them here, and we can keep the good education which is coming in Norwich, Norwich is going to be a better place. So I support this completely. That's a pity I would go a little bit further, I want to do a little bit more. I'm not right into heritage like everyone else is in heritage. I think the concrete's fallen down, it went on as far as I would be concerned. And let's move on with the education stuff and let's look after our kids for a great future. But I can see what everyone's saying about buildings. I don't want it to look like another Anglo Square, which is another thing. But that will come up later on next year. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, we'll move to the vote. All those in favour, please show. That's unanimous.
It's unanimous.
Thank you very much for that. And that's the end of the meeting. Thank you.